I'm photographer David duChemin, and this is Vision is Better, a sometimes weekly podcast about the craft and art of photography. Welcome here. Hey, welcome to a long overdue episode of Vision is Better. Today I want to talk to you about how you can see more creatively, how you can make photographs that take advantage of what we know about the creative process. It's very easy for us to get into this trap where we go to a place and we sort of assume that if we just have the right gear, that we will be able to make better photographs, more creative photographs. And I don't think that's the case. I think that if we go to a place, even with the most minimal amount of gear, but with an understanding of how the creative process works and a willingness to engage in that creative process, I think we can make photographs that are a lot more creative. And one of the things that we need to understand is that creativity needs something to push against. It needs boundaries. It needs something, needs resistance of some sort, a little bit of tension. And so very often we think in terms of the creative process, we want to be free. We don't want any kind of rules, and I kick against rules. I actually, in terms of the arts, don't believe there are any rules. But we don't want boundaries. We don't want restrictions. And the problem with that is that creatively, when you get to a place like I was just in Venice, or these photographs are from coastal Ireland and coastal Scotland. You get there and you have all the gear and you get paralyzed because not only are you trying to see a new place and experience that new place, but you're trying to make photographs of that new place and interpret that new place with your camera. The more gear that you have, the more options you have, the more paralyzing it becomes. Do I use my 300 millimeter or do I use my 18 millimeter? Do I use filters? Do I use my tripod? Which camera do I use? If you can give yourself some constraints, and I don't mean just sort of like accepting the constraints you have. I mean actually creatively, intentionally giving yourself constraints. You can give yourself something that creativity needs to push against, that resistance, and you will make more creative and, in the end, better photographs. Here's a couple of examples. In Venice, I gave myself a couple of constraints. I gave myself a theme. So I, for the most part, only photographed things that were heavily shadowed, backlit, reflected, silhouetted. So I was playing against a very particular set of qualities of light. Now, that doesn't mean that if I saw something amazing in soft morning light on the way to something, that I wouldn't, of course, shoot outside of that constraint. Of course, you need to do that. The constraints are there when you're stuck. The constraints are there to get you to a place of creativity. And if you see something that is outside of those constraints and is just mind-bogglingly amazing, that it pulls at your creativity, then by all means, go photograph that. But when you get stuck, when you come back to the project that you've given yourself constraints for, I think you will find those constraints very liberating. They will also push you, not only are you sort of pushing your creativity, but you're pushing your craft and your art because you will learn new things. So when I was photographing the silhouettes and the reflections, I started to learn a little bit more because this is not something that I normally photograph. I photograph backlight a lot, but if you look through the bulk of my work over the last 5 or 6 years, have always preferred softer, more subtle light. And I was photographing hard, not top of the sky kind of light, but hard light. And so I was underexposing. I was using the Velvia preset, the film emulator on my Fuji cameras, to give me that rich, saturated, heavily shadowed, like really plunge those shadows into blackness kind of look. And as a result, over time, over 3 or 4 days, over eventually what was 2 weeks in Venice, I came out with what I consider quite a strong body of work, and it all came from giving myself constraints. It could be that you give yourself those constraints and 3 days in, you abandon them because you are inspired by something else. You find something else that stirs your paint. But in order to see a little bit more creatively, if you're stuck and you're asking, how can I see more creatively? My first suggestion is you give yourself constraints. Give yourself a different aspect ratio. Like I was photographing only 1:1 square format. You could do 16 by 9, you could do 4 by 5. It's helpful if you have a camera that allows you just to look in the viewfinder and set those. But nevertheless, you can still look through viewfinder and figure out what a square is going to look like. You can also give yourself parameters like shooting only in black and white and removing the color element entirely, so you're focused purely on lines and texture and moments that would force you to see a little bit differently. You could give yourself other constraints as well. You could just try to do, and here's what I'm getting at, do it differently than you've done it before. Einstein said the definition of insanity was doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting things to be different. If you're looking for your photography to take a different turn, to take a bit of a tack in a different direction, and you felt until now a little bit stuck, you may want to consider giving yourself the constraints to do things differently. So if you normally use an 85mm lens, use something like a 16mm lens. If you usually go really wide like I do, then stick a 200 or a 300mm lens on the front of your camera and work on your isolation. But do it differently, mix it up. If you generally photograph backlit stuff like I frequently do, mix it up and try side light or walk all the way around and start experimenting with what are the possibilities with front lit or top lit subjects, and how can you creatively work around your tendency where you would normally go around the other side. You're forcing yourself to learn, you're forcing yourself to solve a problem. That's really all creativity is. How do I solve this problem? Give yourself more problems to solve, more interesting problems, and the work will become more interesting because you will find more interesting solutions. But again, this is just a path to getting to more interesting, more dynamic, and more engaged photographs. So I think the more engaged the photographer is, the more engaged the audience will be. So be more engaged, be more interested, be more curious about your work. And one of the ways that you can do that is with constraints. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really sorry it took me so long to get my act together and get back to an episode. Now that I'm back here in Canada for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, I'm going to record a few episodes. Unfortunately, then I'm going to go back on the road for about 8 or 9, even 10 weeks. But I'm going to try to work in a few more podcast episodes. This is a little bit uncomfortable for me, so I've been really appreciative of your patience, your comments. Please do leave comments in the YouTube field there down below, and give me some questions if there are things. So what is your biggest struggle as a creative photographer? What's your biggest creative struggle? Maybe that would be a good question to answer for this particular episode, and maybe I can address that in future episodes. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. Remember, gear is good, but vision's better. Take care.